You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Would you like to start us with a prayer?
Okay. May I begin with Hail Mary in Latin?
Sure.
Nombre del Father. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tuit mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Santa Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et nostra. Amen. Padre, Hijo, Espíritu Santo. Amen.
This is an opportunity just for me to introduce the show. My name is Dr. Cynthia Toolin-Wilson, and I think you're my 209th interview. So I've been doing this for a while. So the show is author to author, and I am here tonight with Dr. Mario Ramos-Reyes. Is that how I say it? Yes, Ramos?
Yes.
Reyes. And he's talking about his interesting book, Philosophy for Mysterious Times. So how are you doing, Mario?
I'm doing excellent.
That's great. So this sounds like an interesting topic. You define it as mysterious times, and I guess you could interpret that in many ways, the way the world is going nowadays. So,
well, that title came up after the pandemic hit 2020, around March or April.
Mm-hmm.
So I had, like many people, stay home, and I began revising and checking all my papers that I have been writing for years, and notes and things of that nature, and decided to write about my impression of the pandemic, the reaction of people, and connect with a few things that I have been writing for years, particularly notes for my classes about mainly the topic of philosophy, what philosophy is, about ethics, about politics, about religion. And so this book is a collection of short essays, around 1,200 words each. And so I tried to write and condense in each essay about my impression day by day. It lasted at least a year and a half of that time. So the title came up naturally to me because to me was mysterious in the profound sense. That was a dramatic event which we did not have complete picture of the meaning, but trusted in God's providence. I tried to discern and give some account of what was happening. And what is also interesting, at least to me, is that there is the first chapter. It is a little bit a memoir of my beginning as a philosopher back in the late 70s in my home country in Paraguay, home country in the midst of South America. And so how I encounter that wisdom that we call philosophy. So there are a few essays on that encounter, or let's say more clearly, a set of encounter. At least I counted 3 events of my life that changed my life forever, and I decided to study philosophy, teaching philosophy, which was unique and was very strange for someone who was coming from a very poor country with no libraries, under a very, very harsh dictatorship, no freedom. So that is beyond imagination to anyone in America. But I'm proud of saying that I read the classics then in the Thomistic tradition. My formation, I think, was I would call quite good compared to even what we are, or some people are receiving today in some universities. So that is, in a nutshell, my book.
So it's really been, it's really reflecting more than a short period of time. It's going back to the beginning of this, what should we say, love affair with philosophy.
Right. Because
Yeah, that's the way I often think of some of these disciplines, you know. I had no interest in theology when I was young. I wasn't even Christian. And once I started reading theology, I mean, it was like, wow, you know, it just opens up whatever your discipline is. I mean, especially within the Catholic tradition, philosophy or theology, it just changes your life. It really is. It's like, you know, it's like, I don't know, like the first sense of spring or something. You know, you feel alive and you fall in love with it. And it lasts a whole lifetime. Yeah. So.
Yes. And in my case, in this first chapter, which is a memoir, I just described my first encounter in high school to not a professor, but rather I encountered a book. And that book changed my life dramatically. The professor who was teaching in high school, I'm talking about early 70s, in a small country, landlocked country, he was teaching philosophy. And that book was, still is at least in print, was written by one of the most well-known personalists of Spain at that time, and still is, I think, is Julian Marias. And his book, History of Philosophy, was very well written. It's a collection of notes that he took from classes when he was studying at the University of Madrid in the 30s. And this book has a lot, at least 50 editions. So by that time, I just read that book, and the professor whom I'm referring recommended that book, and it changed my life because it showed that basically it's more important. Philosophy is just not a speculative endeavor, rather was an experience of life. That is in the first chapter of that book, which is in accord to what the teacher of Julian Marias taught, Ortega y Gasset, which philosophy is a vital experience. It's something that your life is intimately connected to. It's not just something intellectual. It's not a German idealism. It's an experience. And so that changed, even though, and I noticed in my essay that teacher, who was a very good politician then, he's a courageous man. He already passed away. He was a Kantian, very formal, very strict. So his teaching was not in accord to what the book that he was recommending was very strange. So as a faithful Kantian, he was not someone who you feel passion or feel attracted. At least that was not my experience. It was very formal, very accurate, but he took distance from what is called our human passion. So, however, that class and that book put me into direction, going to to the college. I went to the Catholic University then, and I began studying law. I went to law school. And that's very common. It was very common then for many Latin Americans who the only choice that you had was either go to medicine, engineering, or law. There was no other way of making it, so to speak. And so law was a way to learn about the legal structure, political structure, and then you can read some philosophy along the way. But I think in the second year of law school, I took an elective class, and the title was philosophy. The reason why I took, because I was already under the influence of that first encounter, but I didn't expect much more than what I found in high school. And yet I was surprised by the caliber of the teacher who just showed up in class. He was coming from Louvain. That professor just presented his dissertation. He was a PhD in philosophy. And his class was about the symposium, Plato Symposium, and he started engaging in a dialogue with everyone, and he make the class coming alive. Even though the students who were there were students who were expecting someone to repeat, I don't know, the code or some statue, but this teacher was extraordinary, gifted, and the closeness to the students and the care that he portrayed and you felt, that transformed my view of philosophy. And I said, well, there are people who are living what I encountered in that book. And so, and this professor later became one of the greatest public intellectual in my home country. He already passed away in 2000, almost 2000, the year 2000. He was a phenomenologist to some sort. However, his background was quite Thomistic. And so, but he was basically phenomenology. He was coming from Louvain, where Professor Luypen and all that were his teachers. And so, and I decided then to begin studying philosophy. So I didn't quit law, rather than enroll in some courses, following the curriculum of the School of Philosophy. So I studied both. And that was, I was very young and I had the strength to do that. I went to law school in the afternoon, and then in the evening I went to take classes in School of Philosophy. And so with time, I think the third year of School of Philosophy, that professor himself said that there was another teacher coming from Argentina. He was about to teach metaphysics. We didn't have that subject matter. And the reason why we didn't have is because we didn't have enough. We have three teachers, and we were 5-10 students. We're talking about a dictatorship. We are talking about a very small country where people were not supposed to be studying philosophy. You're not going to earn any money, zero, if you want to feed your family doing philosophy. So we were there, romantic kids who wanted to know something. That is why I never quit law, because law was my I don't know, my backup in order to survive financially. And so, and he said, this professor who is coming back, he was a Paraguayan. He's coming back and he's going to give you or all the students a course in metaphysics. And I said, well, great. And he said, my professor said, don't miss his class. Okay. I narrated everything in my book. And so I went to his class, the first class. I will never forget the first class. The book that he used was the Jacques Maritain 7 Lessons on Being. And he started explaining in very detailed, very calm voice, every single step and the type of being and all that. So to me was eye-opening, so to speak, the sense of awe. And so after the class, I tried to talk to him. He was very, very in a hurry because he had to go to his house, to his home, who was far away from the university. It's far away, it's 2 hours or so. And it was already 9 o'clock in the evening. So he said, well, I don't have the time now. I had to take the bus. But why don't you go to my home? I'm going to wait for you next Saturday or the following Saturday. And I said, okay, sure, Professor. I'm going to go and visit you because I want to talk to you about what you just said in class. Well, I decided to go one Saturday. And I drove my little car. I own a Volkswagen. They are no longer in manufacture. It's a small car, very cheap. And I drove there about an hour and a half, and very small town. Today, if you go there, it's completely different. Today, it's just a big city. Was a small town, and I was looking for his home, and I asked people. We didn't have phone then. We didn't have any GPS or anything of that sort. And so I just had in a piece of paper the address, and so I start asking. And then one kid with barefoot, poor kids, he said, "Oh, I know, Mr. Nunez, I know him. And do you know where he lived?" "Yes, he lived over there." He just pointed out a couple of blocks up north, and he said, "And he's selling water." And I said, "What?" "Well, in Spanish, it's called aguatero, someone who is making money out of selling water. Okay, he has a little bit of land, and so people who were not able to have water in their home, he just selling for a few cents. And so he was there under a tree, a little tank of water, and people with their little things that brought to him, and he just filled with the water. And so, and at the end, they pay a few cents. So I go there, and that was a surprise. Right there, you have someone with a PhD in theology, a PhD in philosophy, selling water in order to survive. And I said, "Oh my God, that's my future." And so, and he was waiting for his client, reading some books, highlighted, and I still remember. And he said, "Well, sit down and let's talk about when I finish my selling these people." And we talked for 2-3 hours. And that is what, and he was, I find in him my true, what I call guidance, my mentor. He was a Thomist. He was at that point, and that's very interesting. At that point, he was a former priest, but hold on. He was one of the first who, after 72, 73, with the crisis, after the council, who at one point wrote famous letter, I didn't know that then, where he asked permission to Paul VI. And he explained why. It's a public record. I have a copy. Mm-hmm. Now, the Pope, after 2 years, allowed him to give him the permission and so on. He married after that, went to Argentina, and then he was coming back when I met him. Now, he had, before I met him, a long career, member of the Catholic Action, great preacher, solid theologian, qualities that he kept until he died at the age of 92, 93 in 2010, 2012. Never once he doubted about anything of the magisterium, ever. In other words, he was more orthodox than many priests who continue being priests. I can show, and I have document about that. So he was really a Thomas. And I can go on and on. So he was my mentor. The director of my thesis I got a licentiate. After 6 years studying philosophy, I got the licentiate. It's called licentiate. And so he guided me, and he was the director of my work. I think I wrote on freedom. And introduced me to Jacques Maritain and Etienne Gilson and the classics, Garrigou, Lagrange, and all that. And so, and finally, to make a conclusion on this short account of my life, after that, I encountered, just being a very young teacher at the Catholic University in the late 80s. I was just doing philosophy and teaching high school, sometimes 3 in order to make ends meet. And so one day I encountered a priest who looked for me. I never looked for him. I never knew who he was. And he's still alive. He's the only one who's still alive. An Italian priest who was on a mission in my home country. He said, well, I know you. And I said, no, you don't. We never met. No, I know you because I know some of your students. And they have spoke to me about you. Okay, Father. And he said, I want to meet you. Do you have time now? And I said, I know I'm teaching right now, but I'm leaving. I finish at 9:30. And he said, I'm going to wait for you. And so he waited for me, and we went to eat dinner. So for me was a complete change of my life, in the sense that my philosophy at this point was quite speculative, even though it was very orthodox and very clear. He said, well, life is more than that. Christian life is an experience. And so he introduced me a view of life as incarnated. So he was one of the first missionaries of the, what we call today, movement. Ecclesial movement then was very new, or relatively new. In South America was new, which is communion and liberation. So the liberation was the sense of communion, the sense of communion. And so without saying much, without preaching, without telling me what to do, he just offered his friendship. That's the word, friendship. We are friends, and we are going into the same pilgrimage toward our own destiny. And so that view changed completely my view of even the Christian life, because I had some view, which were what we call very moralistic. Many things we ought to do instead of focusing on how we together, in the sense of communion, can trust one another in this love. After the encounter, we slowly move to our true liberation. So, and then I incorporated slowly all my philosophical background into that experience. And I never changed since then, ever. I may have had some crisis, if you will, coming into the U.S., studying in a public university where no one and zero understood even my language. I'm not talking about it because I spoke in Spanish. They didn't understand the language of
philosophy,
Thomistic tradition,
yeah,
or Christian tradition. They didn't know what when I remember writing the human person, I used the human person, and one professor said to me, "No, you don't have to use person. Human is human." And I said, "No, because it's a divine person as well." Well, that's your assumption. You need to just to write human. And that was a full professor. And how in the world I have to, I should survive, if you will, here. And so that was my journey, and was very difficult. But what kept me alive in my faith was my background, my encounter. Even though I chose to write my dissertation on Jack Maritain, and my committee were people, none of them was Catholic. And I did it. And we discussed, and I did all my research, and so at the end, many of them were very sympathetic and impressed. And I'm talking about the 90s up to until the year 2000. The year 2000, probably, I was already a doctor, but things changed after the September 11 and all that. So things got even worse, I think, in that sense. But what is my point? My point is that when anyone have meaningful encounter when they are young, that has a lasting legacy. I think I will never forget that. Always when I doubt something, I try to go back to what these professors or pre have told me, and kept me alive, alive in the spiritual sense.
Yeah, so that's quite a story. You know, so many people have an encounter, but you seem to have had quite a few, you know, and they seem to have all had tremendous effect on you. You're lucky.
Or perhaps what I say very often is, I have just one encounter. But the mystery encountered me 3 or 4 times.
Yeah. Okay.
Explicitly. I may have other, but I was probably distracted, didn't pay attention. But I still remember vividly every single instance when I have those encounters. I wrote about it. Now, any other impression that I may have after that, I just forgot. But those were, it's
life-changing,
intelligible rationally. It's something that is happening and you don't know why, but it's giving you a sense of joy. You know, this joy is coming from. And so, and it's illuminated in many ways. Now, that is, I can tell you another story. I always wanted to study theology. I never studied theology up to that point. But I always wanted to be curious about theology. And I always said to myself, I'm not a really Catholic because I don't know how to, I'm really Catholic because I don't know how to quote the scripture. My evangelical friends know everything about the scripture, ups and down, back and forth. I didn't know that. I'm a Catholic. But I said always, someday I will study theology. Someday, when I get older. But I never had opportunity. Why? Because I was already teaching. I was married. And so what am I going to do? Just study for myself? Yes, I continue reading here and there, but not systematically. And yet, after many years, in the late year 2000, 2008, or 10, I remember right now, there was an offer given by Ave Maria University. They were about to open, let's call a branch, not a branch, but yes, a little branch for a while in the diocese where I'm located. And so, and they establish a master program in theology. So the teachers would be flying from Naples, Florida, every 2 months. And we would have classes the whole weekend, beginning, I think, Friday up to Sunday evening, so that we can complete the number of hours required by the school. And so was very intense at 27 credit, and it's that theology. And so I decided to apply, and I began studying theology late in life. That was 10 years ago. And so that 2 years that lasted the program were very, very, to me, were very meaningful.
Sure.
Even though I never had that type of encounter that I had before, but many questions that I had lingering were answered because we have a very good professor in moral theology and sacred scriptures and canon law. And so I got, after 2 years, my master in theology. Even though I always say very carefully, I'm not a theologian. I don't have the skills for being a theologian. I'm a philosopher. No, I can know things about theology, but I don't have the ear for a theologian. I respect them profoundly, and I know what they are debating. But when I debate, I don't want to engage in those things. I prefer philosophical thing and use argument and all that, because that's I think is my nature.
Well, we all have different callings, and clearly yours is to philosophy. And it seems to have served you very well. It's clear to me the way you talk. If you could see how your face lights up when you talk about philosophy and you talk about those encounters, I mean, you can see how much they still, you're more full of life than you were a few seconds before you start talking about them. So that's really, that's really wonderful. So many people think that they love something and, 10 years down the road, they say, I think I'll go study something else. Those encounters really had an impact, permanent impact. And it is apparent when you talk about them.
Yes. And particularly when I was doing my dissertation at the University of Kansas, I have very good advisor but they were not Catholic, but they were very good, very respectful, very erudite, some of them. so many times I said, well, I don't know how I'm going to write this or explain this. And then one day I said, well, I need someone to ask about these things. I'm talking about the 90s. And so I look at, I was doing my research at the library and I found, well, there are some Tommies around the country. And I wrote a letter I was reading Ralph McInerney book on Pippin Thomas. And I said, I'm going to write this professor. He lives in Indiana. And so I wrote a letter. I mean, those years, you write a letter. Well, you don't have emails. You don't have.
That's true.
And so I wrote a short letter and well, he received it and he called me by phone to my home, to my apartment, and I was not there. He left a message. We have answering machines then.
Yeah.
And so I called him back. And what was my question? I said, well, Professor, I'm doing X, Y, or Z, and I know that you are there at the Jack Samaritan archives and all that. And he said, yes. And I said, out of my desperation, I said, do you think that I should move into Notre Dame? And he said, no, don't do that. Because we are going through the same crisis.
Yeah.
He said, and don't worry about it. I'm going to accompany you. I'm going to support you. If you have any question, I will send you material, resources, and so on. So that was it. And I think was very helpful because moving was a little crazy. I mean, it's not like today. It's another world. And so that, I think, these resources I got from my background and what we need sometimes, and scholars and many other people who are not scholars, is people whom they can get together, trust, and be friends so that the world is not it's not destroying them, if you will. Because very often, sometimes the culture is in such a disarray that we lose hope. And we need to be aware that we are here together, even though we may be far away from one another. Now, today it's easier because we have Zoom and many other way of contact. We can form group in WhatsApp about our concern and our vocation.
Yeah. When you think of the difference between even 20 years ago and today, the access that we have to other people through technology is truly amazing. I mean, even if it's not even just between individuals, I mean, who would ever think that people could get good Catholic education by sitting in front of a computer? And interacting with people. It's truly, the whole, I don't know what we would call it, just this whole revolution, the computer revolution, the digital revolution has really had some horrible effects, but it can also be used for tremendous good. I interview people all the time, twice a week, and I have met Catholics that are so strong and that have such insights that they're able to share with me and through me to other people. It's amazing to me that this has happened in my lifetime. Like you, I came from the time when you went to the library and if you were lucky, they had a Xerox machine and you could copy something. No more do we have to go through that. But so it is
Exactly.
something wonderful.
Yes.
So many people see it as an evil, and certainly it can be used for evil, but it also has a wonderful side.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a means. Yeah. It's
Oh,
a
yeah.
mean.
Yeah. Wonderful tool. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's truly amazing. Gee, I remember when the technology was, to get like an adding machine. And then at one point we got these little calculators. It was like that was something. And now here we talk to people on the other side of the world in real time about important things. It's amazing.
Yes. Yes. and also for sharing information with exchange of views. That is very helpful. Right now, one of my projects, hopefully I can finish by next year, is how can I call the genre? It's a memoir, more or less. It's history, but it's also political philosophy, which is the account of the rise and the decline of Christian democracy in Latin America. So how the whole movement came about, what are the figures, the relevant intellectuals and politicians, and why is some reason they decline. And so the figure which is central in this development, at least in my account, is Maritain. And how his influence in the 1920s and 30s when he traveled there and began forming small groups, reached to its peak in the 60s with a couple of presidents in Venezuela, in Chile, who were Maritain disciples, and they claim, and not only they claim, Maritain claimed they were. And then the decline for mainly the crisis of the council on the one hand, but I do believe it's more the influence of liberation theology, which penetrated many group of Christian Democrat, and then at the end everything fell apart and disappeared. Today it's not only unintelligible for young people to talk about Christian democracy. They not even know, they not even are aware that such a movement existed. Because the force, if you will, of secularism is such that no one in politics wants to call himself Christian. It's just synonymous as hater or something, someone intolerant and so. But the movement was powerful and influential. Now, I'm not saying that was the best utopian way of dealing with politics, which it wasn't. Now, none of them claimed that they had the solution, rather than that was a way of understanding the Catholic tradition within the framework of civil liberties. And it's a very Maritain view. Like Rose Dowhat wrote a piece in New York Times 4 months ago. He said, gentle Catholicism is more genteel. So now that was the idea of Christian democracy in Latin America. In Europe was a little bit different, but not quite. And so I'm working on that. And in order, my goal is just to let people know, the new generation, that view existed and was doable and was reasonable. And it was not a bunch of fundamentalists, far away from that. And they were very orthodox in their faith. I'm not talking about here a progressivism. No, they were very, very common, sensical people. And which was an alternative to other views were very extreme, coming from the left and coming from the right. And so I'm working in, hopefully I will finish next year. And in order to write that, I'm getting contact with people in all over the world. I'm just this morning was talking to someone in Argentina who knew also. He has some sources, and he said, yeah. And we were discussing. So these ideas, or this way of exchange was completely, was impossible in the 90s. Because unless you travel to those places and do some research, now we have very easy access. The only thing we need to do is to get to know these people, ask questions, and we can get chat with Zoom and work in this work together.
Yeah. Well, that's, when you think of it, that's very significant. It seems common sense when you say it, but so many people would never think of approaching that way. So.
In what sense?
Well, it makes sense to try to understand things that have happened in the past in terms of what was going on in the past, not in our interpretation of it from our life now. And I think that that's often a problem because people actually don't know much history. I don't know why that is. Everyone has to take history classes, but I don't think that people necessarily, they tend to interpret what has been thought or done in the past through the eyes of the present, instead of trying to understand it from the eyes of the past. And that's when you're talking about the type of people that you're talking to and that you have talked to, they don't seem to suffer from that mistake. So that's really important. And I mean, it's very, it's very easy for people to make that mistake because we always think that we're progressing. Sometimes we're not. We may be moving forward, but actually backwards, and so we think we're progressing. And so when we think about something that occurred in the past, we think, well, well, that was wrong. Look at what we know now. And it's not right. So that historical perspective, I think, is not valued by very many people today. And I see that in you. You value that. And you're talking to people that understand that the same way as you do. So you can actually, I think you can come up with material that others would look at and not understand, but you can really understand it. That's good. I wish I could do that. But yeah, it's very good.
What you're saying, I learned, and that I learned in the early 80s, that perhaps that come from the Spanish tradition, particularly personalist tradition. Ortega y Gasset was not a personalist, but yet many of his disciples were. It's very interesting. And he was an agnostic, and yet one of the greatest Catholic philosophers in Spain were his disciples. Yeah. Because he respected what was his motto. I am who I am in my circumstances. That was his motto. And so many disciples had different circumstances. And they have different experience regarding the mystery of God. And he said, okay, you are who you are according to your circumstances. And though they build this view based on what he called historicity of human enterprise. We are historical beings. We are not an attraction. And so if we forget history, we forget who we are.
Yeah.
And as you said, we just make things, make up things about history. We just project our ideological lenses into the past rather than understanding and do a very accurate hermeneutic about the past. And so that is why today we are going through this, I call craziness of destroying statues that remember us about the past as we could erase the past. The past is what it is. It may have some problems, of course. We are not perfect. Have some glories, of course. But the past is what it is. We cannot change the past. It's change who we are. And that, I think, is a lack of understanding. And that is getting even, I think, more the mistake that we are making as a culture and society is graver because when we ignore history, we don't know where to go. We make things up. And we believe that we have all the solution through technology. And instead of looking at the past, we trust in algorithm. And so that's insane. That's irrational.
It is, but it's also getting more prevalent, I think. But as I say, I'm not exactly sure why this is happening. I know in this country, everyone has to study history, even to get a high school diploma. You have to study history in Western civilization and sometimes Eastern civilization in college. And yet it's like, I don't know how the disjoint occurs, but there's a tremendous disjoint, because everything is interpreted from now. And now isn't what was happening then. So.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's, that I think it's a gift to you that you have that, a gift of you, that you have that sensibility. And it's certainly something that will, I think, have positive effects on the people who are taught by you or who read your work. Yeah.
Yes, that's I don't know if my vocation, my calling, because I always say that for me, philosophy is not a written enterprise, it's an oral enterprise. In that sense, I'm coming from more the Mediterranean tradition, more continental, if you will, less written tradition. So philosophy you do in your classroom, in the public square, through newspaper columns, much more than through research articles or papers. And that's a tradition. Now, people in academic circle would say that's not philosophy. I disagree with that. I think it's the opposite. I think you need to engage with people who are out there and who may not have the language you have, but they have the intuition, they have the same problems, they have to confront the same drama that you are. And that's philosophy. There is a famous article that I have in my desk, in front of my desk, which is called, it's written by Julian Marias. It's called Periodismo y Filosofía. It's journalism and philosophy. It's a 1,000 word article, where he made the case that the greatest of all philosophers always wrote in pieces. And in the 20th century, he said many of them, particularly in the Spanish tradition or the Latin tradition, they wrote very thoughtful, a newspaper column.
Mm-hmm.
And so for today, those columns, of course, for the common professor of philosophy, don't understand very well, but very well written,
Mm-hmm.
very well throughout, very well established, because you need to convey people who may not be an expert in philosophy about different issues. In his case, Maria's wrote hundreds of thousands of them. And many of his books is just a collection of them that he organized in sequence. And so it's very, very important. In other words, that's an oral type of philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
The orality, they engage with the public square.
Mm-hmm.
In the U.S., perhaps the tradition of Mortimer Adler or people like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I think that is important. And when you teach, that is very important, because students don't want to hear you talk about your papers, which are unintelligible for them. They want to talk about their own dramas, their own issues, their anxieties and questions. And so, and that is, I think, philosophy all about.
Mm-hmm. Well, I tend to agree with you. So you have some very important insights.
Yes.
Yeah, and passing, when you pass anything like that on to your students, you're also helping them to learn how to think. That's really important. There's a lot of very educated people. I don't know if it's just in this country or if it's everywhere, but there are very many highly educated people in this country that I often wonder if they can think. They know their discipline and they work within it, but it's like a box, and that's something that we need to avoid. Obviously you have to know your discipline. I'm not saying not, but you have to be able to relate to other things, and so often they can't.
I always remind my student that when I teach ethics or moral philosophy, I say, well, the question is not how people live. The question is how people ought to live.
Yeah.
We need to find the norms and the principles of a good life. It's not just an account of how people live in such and such group or tribe or whatever. It's the same thing. I say, well, the question is that people don't think. Everyone thinks. But the question is how we ought to think. And then we need to know the basic of logic. What is a premise? What is a conclusion? What is a minor term? And the basic Aristotelian logic. And that's completely absent from, I'm sorry to say, many speeches of politicians and sometimes papers. They ignore what the basic of logic is. And that speak not well about our education.
No, it doesn't. Yeah, you're right. I agree. I think if you, apart from issues of, social class, and in this country, even though we all pretend we're equal, I mean, obviously we are equal as humans, but we pretend that all are valued equally, which is, to me, not the truth. I think of people having native intellect. They've got the ability to learn, but they're never given the opportunity to learn. I've taught in college prior to Holy Apostles, and you'll have someone who's studying for a bachelor's degree and they can barely read, and it's like, how did how did you get out of high school?
Right.
But it's like when I look apart from social class issues in this country, which I think are still very strong, and ethnic issues in this country, it's I just think of the amount of, I don't know if I should use the word waste, but it's like people who could understand and know things at a deeper level, that the meaningful things, and they never will, because they're not being given the opportunity. And a great deal of that, I think, is because of, the way philosophy is taught. I mean, when you look at even, if you have maybe a high school course in Intro to Philosophy, it's really only learning names and what people thought. It's not learning how to think. And so this country, and I mean, I don't know what other countries, but I'm assuming most, because this seems to be the movement we're currently undergoing. It's a sad thing for the cultures, but it's a terrible thing for the people. I mean, can you imagine going through your whole life not really being able to think? I mean, you obviously, thoughts go through your mind, but you can't have any organized or anything logical. It's a human tragedy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right.
Mm-hmm.
And one student a couple of weeks ago said, okay, but we cannot have, he said, philosophical outlook like you have. And I said, what? What is my philosophical outlook? I don't know. Do I have a scientific outlook? The only outlook that I have is that I get to know things through my senses. And you do know through your senses as well. We are in the same boat. And so I said, okay, how do you know that I'm here? Because I'm looking at you. Okay, see? And so I start going through basic 101 Aristotelian music. Well, common sense. But it's not my philosophical outlook. It's human way of knowing things. I don't have innate ideas. And why? Well, have you found a baby saying what motherhood is? No. See? He's going to learn later. And so, but that, I don't know where this kid get this idea. Say, well, the philosophical outlook, the way of thinking, those ideological, talking points, which prevent them from thinking not only rationally, have a common sense thinking. We know through our senses, and we move from there, and that is what Aquinas did, and Aristotle said the same society is perhaps better than others, but it's common sense. For them, that is a revelation. It's something that for them is just, wow, it is common sense. My point is that the talking point of the media, the culture, is in such a disarray that are not educating, are confusing things. And it's very simple sometimes. At least it's simple how to start thinking seriously.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how we get from where we are to where we should be.
Sorry about that.
I mean, really, it's true. I don't know how we will or how we can. And as I said, I imagine much of the world is in the same kettle of fish, so to speak.
Yeah.
So it's kind of kind of depressing. You know, it's like, think of it as knowing the answer, but no one's willing to listen. You know, it's like, we have the answer. No, you don't. So, I don't know. It's interesting when you think about the state of the world, you know, because it is in such disarray. I don't know.
There is an anecdote. I don't know if that is a true anecdote, but it's still an anecdote of Winston Churchill after the war, I think 1948, or he was no longer prime minister, and he came to the U.S., went to Massachusetts to the MIT, and people were explaining to him the advances in technology and all those things at that time. The researchers were doing, and one of the presenters said, "Here you have a technology that in the future could prevent another Hitler to rise again, and you will not need more about politics because we are going to control everything. Technology is going to solve those issues." And so Churchill just listened carefully, and he said nothing. And at the end, he said, "Well, Mr. Churchill, what do you say about that?" And he said, "Well, the only thing that I want to say about that is I would like to be dead by then."
I love that. I never heard that before, but that's a good answer, isn't it?
Right. That's
that's very good. Yeah, I like it. Well, Winston Churchill, he was really something.
Right.
They don't make them like him anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is great. I hope to be dead. Oh boy. Oh wow. Well,
okay.
This has been a very, very interesting interview for me.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're quite the thinker. You know, you might be able to be one of the people that's actually able to have. I think you can actually have a big influence. I hope so.
Well, I'm trying.
Yes, well, you just keep trying.
Yeah.
God will help.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep. Okay. Would you like to close us in prayer?
Can I pray in Spanish?
Of course.
En nombre del Padre, del Hijo, del Espíritu Santo. Amén. Dios te salve María, llena eres de gracia, el Señor es contigo, bendita tú eres entre todas las mujeres y bendito es el fruto de tu vientre Jesús. Santa María, Madre de Dios, ruega por nosotros pecadores, ahora y en la hora de nuestra muerte. Amén. Thank you. Thank you very much for this time.
Well, thank you.
I really enjoyed
it. I did too. I had a great time, and I learned a lot too.
Okay.
So if you ever want another interview, just let me know and we'll do it again.
Okay, I will.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, you take care.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.